The sun hammered down on Millbrook in mid-June, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and turned car hoods into mirrors. The Riverside Community Pool had been the heart of the neighborhood for 37 years, a blue rectangle of relief that went from municipal property to sacred ground the moment school let out. Corinne Mitchell stood at the gatehouse, a position she'd held for 16 seasons, and surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a woman who'd finally found something she could control. Her clipboard was laminated. Her whistle hung at a precise angle. Her rules were printed on signs in fonts she'd selected herself, approved by the Recreation Department with minimal pushback because Corinne had a way of making things sound both reasonable and non-negotiable. She was 53, divorced, and had devoted the last 3 years to this job with the intensity other women her age directed toward grandchildren or travel plans. Her sister said it was concerning. Her therapist said it was finding purpose. Corinne said it was just doing the job right. The pool rules were simple. Community members only. Valid ID at all times. No running. No glass. No exceptions. That last one was underlined 3 times in red Sharpie. On a Tuesday morning, as Corinne was organizing the supply closet and mentally running through the chemical levels, a woman approached the gate with a boy in tow. The woman was younger, maybe mid-40s, with the particular exhaustion that came from working 2 jobs. The boy was tall for his age, dark-skinned, with a fade haircut that his mother had probably paid too much for. He carried his towel like a dream. "Hi," the woman said, slightly out of breath. "I'd like to register my son for the summer swim program. I live on Birch Street, just 3 blocks from here." Corinne looked up from her clipboard. "Did you bring your ID?" Of course. The woman, Diane, her name was, she'd introduced herself, but Corinne's brain was already categorizing rather than retaining, pulled out her driver's license. Birch Street. Birch was technically part of the Riverside district, though it sat right on the edge, where the tree-lined residential streets met the beginning of the commercial district. Corinne examined the ID with the focus of someone looking for a reason to say no. "This is your current address?" "Yes, we moved there in March." Corinne tapped her pen against her clipboard. "The thing is, Riverside Pool serves the central Riverside neighborhood specifically. Birch Street is more of a transitional area. We have limited capacity, and we prioritize families who are deeply embedded in the community, established residents, people whose kids have been coming here for years." Diane's son leaned against her leg, still clutching his towel. He'd been looking at the water, his expression unreadable. "But I live here," Diane said carefully. "We're in the district, I pay property taxes, I vote here." "The rules are quite clear." Corinne turned the clipboard around, pointing to the laminated sign. "Community members only, and community status requires recommendation from an established resident and verification of." "It's a public pool," Diane interrupted, and Corinne heard the tremor in her voice, not anger yet, but moving toward it. "Tax dollars funded this. My tax dollars. Why would I need a recommendation to use a public facility?" Corinne had prepared for this question. She'd prepared for many questions. "The Recreation Department makes the distinction between public and community exclusive," she said smoothly. "We operate with limited resources. Our priority is preserving the experience for the established community. New families can certainly use the larger municipal pool downtown, much newer facility, Olympic-sized lanes." "That's 15 miles away." "Yes, well," Corinne was already glancing back at her clipboard, the universal signal that the conversation was over. "That's the policy. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful." She wasn't sorry, she was satisfied. This was exactly the kind of situation where the rules mattered, where someone needed to say no so that everything didn't descend into chaos. Corinne had learned that lesson early. Her father had run a small business without clear rules, and it had been a circus. Her ex-husband had ignored rules about fidelity. Rules were the skeleton that held things upright. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, then took her son's hand. "Come on, baby," she said quietly, and they turned toward the gate. The boy looked back at the water one more time. Just a glance, the briefest moment of longing before he turned away. That should have been the end of it. Later that week, on a Thursday morning, Corinne was checking chlorine levels when a town car pulled up to the gatehouse. She didn't recognize it at first. A black Lincoln with tinted windows, the kind of car that didn't belong in parking lots that mostly held Honda Civics and aging Subarus. A man stepped out. He was in his early 60s, distinguished in the way that came from money and purpose, with gray temples and a suit that looked like it cost more than Corinne's monthly rent. It took her a moment to recognize him, Thomas Harrison, the mayor. The actual mayor of the actual town. Corinne's stomach did something complicated. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, approaching with his hand extended. His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to make people feel special. "Mayor Harrison," Corinne managed, standing up and shaking his hand. His grip was firm. His eyes were kind. This was somehow worse than if they'd been cold. "What brings you to the pool?" "I heard we had a situation this week," he said. He wasn't smiling exactly, but his face had that open, concerned expression that politicians wore. "A young resident who wasn't able to access our community pool." Corinne's mouth went dry. "I turned away a family who didn't meet the community residency requirements," she said carefully. "We have to enforce standards or—" "Birch Street is within the district," the mayor said. It wasn't a question. "Technically, yes, but—" "And the family is paying property taxes." "The mother claims—" "Mrs. Mitchell." He stepped closer, and his voice remained warm, but something shifted in his eyes. Something that reminded Corinne why he'd been elected 3 terms in a row. "Do you know who brought this to my attention?" Corinne shook her head. "Our town councilwoman," he said. "Patricia Aucaffer. She's Diane Chen's neighbor. She mentioned that a young man was denied access to a public facility despite living in the designated service area. A young man whose mother is a nurse at County Medical, works night shifts, pays her taxes, votes in our elections. A taxpayer who was told her child couldn't use a taxpayer-funded facility." "The rules—" "I understand the rules exist," Mayor Harrison said. "I also understand that rules are meant to serve the community, not impede it, and I'm wondering if perhaps your interpretation of the community residency requirement has become a bit restrictive." He wasn't angry. That was the terrifying part. He was disappointed, the way someone is disappointed when they've given another person the benefit of the doubt and been let down. "We're at capacity," Corinne said, but her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "Are we?" The mayor glanced at the pool, where exactly 4 teenagers and an older man doing water aerobics occupied the lanes. "Because it looks like we have room." "During peak hours?" "I'd like to offer a different solution," the mayor said, and now he smiled, and it was kind and terrible. "I'm going to come by tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I'm going to swim some laps, get my exercise in, and I'm going to invite Young—" "What's the boy's name?" "I don't know," Corinne whispered. "Diane's son. I'm going to invite him to join me, as my guest, and we're going to have a wonderful time, and everything is going to feel very normal and natural." He waited. Corinne understood this was the moment where she was supposed to agree, to say thank you, to understand that this was how power worked. This was a man explaining the rules to her. "Mayor, that's not, we have a system." "Mrs. Mitchell." His voice hardened slightly, just enough for her to hear the steel. "I'm not asking. I'm informing you of my schedule, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, with the boy, and I'm trusting that you'll understand this is the right thing to do." He turned and walked back to his car, his footsteps precise and final. Corinne stood frozen, her clipboard pressed to her chest like armor that had just failed. She watched him drive away, and she understood, with the clarity that comes from a fear so profound it cuts through everything else, that she had made a terrible mistake. Or rather, that she was about to have a choice made for her, and that refusal was no longer actually an option. That night, Corinne couldn't sleep. She sat in her small kitchen with a glass of wine she didn't particularly enjoy and scrolled through articles about Mayor Harrison on her laptop. He was popular. Polling suggested he'd win a 4th term handily. He was known for being progressive on housing issues, tough on corporate pollution, and mysterious about his personal life. Divorced, no children, devoted to the job. He had a reputation for integrity and for following through on what he said. She thought about his hand in hers, warm and certain. She thought about the boy's face as he turned away from the water. She thought about the signs she'd printed and laminated, the careful rules she'd constructed to make sure everything ran perfectly. She thought about the satisfaction she'd felt when people followed them, when the pool ran smooth as clockwork, when she was the person who knew the answers. At 3 a.m., she poured the rest of the wine down the sink. By 6 a.m., she'd changed her mind about everything at least 40 times. By 8:30 a.m., when Mayor Harrison's car pulled up to the pool, Karen was standing at the gate in her official capacity, her whistle around her neck, her heart in her throat. She saw Diane and the boy arrive in a battered Toyota, the mother moving with careful caution, the boy moving with the particular slowness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment but desperately hoped he was wrong. The mayor stepped out of his car in his swimming trunks and a t-shirt, his silver chest hair visible at the neckline, his movements easy and natural. "Good morning, Karen," he called out, using her first name as though they were old friends. "Beautiful day for a swim." He approached the boy with his hand already extended. "You must be Isaiah," the mayor said, because apparently he'd done his homework. "I'm Thomas Harrison. I'm the mayor, but more importantly, I'm a man who loves swimming. Your mother says you're quite the athlete. I'd love to challenge you to a race. Would you be interested in that?" The boy's eyes went wide. He looked at his mother, who stood frozen with her hand over her mouth. "Really?" Isaiah's voice was small and careful. "Really?" the mayor said. He glanced at Karen, and there was something in his eyes, not quite a threat, but a promise. "I'm sure Mrs. Mitchell will want to make sure you get checked in properly. All our guests are welcome here at Riverside." He held out his hand to Isaiah, and the boy took it, and Karen watched as he led the child into the pool area like he'd just changed the course of someone's entire life. Which he had. Which he was doing, right now, with the casual power of a man who knew that the world bent to accommodate his version of fairness. Diane approached Karen with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much for—" "I didn't do anything," Karen heard herself say, her voice hollow. "You let him in," Diane said. "I know that came from you." But it hadn't. It had come from the mayor, had been forced down from above, had bypassed her entirely. Karen realized, with a clarity that felt like standing naked in winter, that she'd been understood. Not as someone in charge of this place, but as someone who could be overridden, whose authority was conditional, whose rules only mattered until someone with actual power decided they didn't. She watched the mayor dive into the pool with the ease of a man who'd learned to swim before he learned to negotiate. She watched Isaiah follow him, the boy's face transformed by joy. She watched her careful system dissolve like the chlorine in the water. And in the gatehouse, Karen sat down in her plastic chair and understood, for the first time in 16 seasons, that she had no idea what came next. End of Part 1. Karen's authority shattered. The gates have opened, the rules have broken, and Karen Mitchell must now confront the difference between control and justice. Part 2. Ripples. The pool didn't change on the surface. The same families came on the same days. The water remained the correct temperature. The chemical levels stayed balanced, but something fundamental had shifted, like an earthquake so small that only certain structures would eventually collapse. By the following week, there were 3 new families requesting pool access. One lived on Oak Street, which was even more on the boundary than Birch Street. Another lived in an apartment complex that Karen had always categorized as just outside the district. The third family, the Rodriguezes, lived in the converted warehouse district, an area that Karen had always thought of as being on the wrong side of things, though she couldn't quite articulate what she meant by that. Karen denied all of them. She cited the same rules she'd always cited. She pointed to the same laminated signs. She explained the community residency requirements with the same smooth efficiency she'd used for years. The difference was that now she knew that her rules didn't actually hold any real authority. They held only what authority people were willing to grant her, and that authority was apparently quite fragile. The calls to the recreation department started on day 3. Karen didn't take them directly. They went to her supervisor, Derek, a tired man in his 50s who worked in the town offices downtown and visited the pool approximately never. He called her into his office on a Friday afternoon, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "We're getting complaints," he said, not looking at her, "about access policies." "The rules have been in place for years," Karen said. "Everyone's always understood them." "The mayor's office reached out," Derek continued, still not meeting her eyes. "They're suggesting we review our interpretation of the service district." "He already pushed through one exception," Karen said. "I don't see why we need to." "They're saying it's not an exception," Derek interrupted. "They're saying it's revealing that our existing policy is overly restrictive and not in keeping with the town charter, which specifies that municipally funded pools serve the designated service area, not some subset of that area based on social standing. I never said anything about social standing, Karen heard herself say, and she could hear the panic in her own voice. It's about community integration, established families. I know what you meant, Derek said, and now he did look at her, and his eyes were tired and kind and condescending in exactly the way that made Karen's face burn. The problem is that I don't think you meant it to sound like what it sounds like, which is gatekeeping. I'm doing my job, Karen said. Your job is to manage the pool, Derek said. Not to manage the community, there's a difference. He dismissed her, and Karen walked back to the pool with her head buzzing like it was full of wasps. She understood what was happening. She was being overruled. She was being told she was wrong, but not in a way that would allow her to fix it because the problem was her and you couldn't fix yourself. That evening, she sat in her living room and researched the town charter on her laptop. It was dull, procedural stuff, mostly about municipal bonds and budget allocations. But there in Section 4, Article 7, was the relevant language. Municipal recreational facilities shall serve residents of the designated service area without regard to tenure, status, or other discriminatory factors. Without regard to discriminatory factors. Karen had never thought of it as discrimination. She'd thought of it as standards. She'd thought of it as protection. She'd thought of it as being careful. But reading it now, in black and white, she understood that what she'd been calling standards and what the town charter was calling discrimination were perhaps the same thing, just described from different directions. She closed the laptop and poured herself a vodka. Monday morning, Derek appeared at the pool with new guidance in writing. The policy, effective immediately, was that all residents of the designated service area, and here they'd expanded the description of the area with a map that included the warehouse district and extended the boundary further than Karen's version had, would be permitted to access the pool with proof of residency. No letters of recommendation, no community integration requirements, just residency. Karen read the memo 3 times, her hands shaking slightly. By end of business that day, she'd had 17 requests for pool access. By the end of the week, she'd processed 32. She was drowning, not in the water, but in forms, in names, in the sudden expansion of her carefully controlled world into something she couldn't contain. She'd run the pool for 16 seasons on the foundation of knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't, and now everyone belonged, and the categories she'd built her entire identity around had become irrelevant. Isaiah Chen came to the pool every day that first full week. He was there at 10 a.m. when the lap swimmers came, and he stayed until late afternoon, working his way through the recreational swim classes that the town offered. He was a natural swimmer, long-limbed and graceful, and he made friends quickly with the other kids. By day 3, he'd started sitting with a group of children from other families, teaching them a game he'd invented involving diving for coins. Karen watched him from the gatehouse. She couldn't look away. It was like watching the proof of her own wrongness swimming laps in real time. On Friday of that week, Diane Chen approached her. I wanted to say thank you, Diane said. She was holding a baked good in a container, cookies, probably, or brownies, the universal gesture of gratitude. Isaiah's been talking about swimming all week. He wants to try out for the competitive team next year. You've given him something. The mayor gave it to him, Karen said, and her voice came out harsher than she intended. Diane's expression flickered with confusion. I mean, the mayor is the one who... Karen didn't finish the sentence. I was just following the rules. Maybe, Diane said gently, the rules needed to change. She set the container of cookies on Karen's desk and walked away, and Karen sat there staring at them like they were evidence at a crime scene. Which, in a way, they were. Evidence that she'd been wrong about something fundamental. Evidence that her careful categories had been designed to exclude rather than to include, and that she'd been so focused on what she'd thought she was doing, maintaining order, protecting the community, that she'd never asked what it actually meant to be protected. The revelation didn't make Karen feel better. If anything, it made her feel worse, because at least when she'd been certain about her rules, she'd had the comfort of certainty. Now she had guilt, which was more honest but much less pleasant. She started making small changes. When the Rodriguez family came in and the mother looked nervous, Karen made an effort to smile. When a teenager she didn't recognize got in without stopping at the gatehouse, she decided to let it slide rather than make a scene. When new residents asked questions about the policy, she explained it in neutral tones, without the edge that had crept into her voice before. But she still felt angry. She was angry at the mayor for making her the bad guy. She was angry at Derek for backing him up. She was angry at Diane Chen for being grateful, because gratitude was harder to hate than defiance. And underneath all of that, she was angry at herself, which was the worst anger of all, the kind that had nowhere to go. 2 weeks into the new policy, Karen overheard a conversation at the pool. Two mothers, sitting on the bleachers, watching their children in the water. "It's so much nicer now," one of them was saying. "Isaiah's brought so many more kids in. There's more energy. It's actually fun instead of feeling like a club, you know." "I know," the other woman said. "Sarah was saying the same thing, though I have to say I miss when it was quieter. Sometimes I just wanted to come and not have to deal with crowds." "Yeah, but that was kind of the point, wasn't it? To keep it just for us." "Was it?" The second woman didn't sound certain. Karen stood very still, pretending to count towels, listening to this particular version of her own thoughts reflected back at her from people who'd never had to do the hard work of gatekeeping. Late August brought the first hint that summer was ending. The heat didn't break yet, but the light changed, becoming more golden and less harsh. Children started wearing backpacks. Conversations shifted to back-to-school clothes and summer reading lists. Isaiah had become a fixture at the pool. He came every day, swam with the intensity of someone who'd been given access to something precious and was determined to get his money's worth. He'd even started helping with the younger kids' swim classes, demonstrating strokes, showing them how to float on their backs. Mayor Harrison had never come back to the pool. Karen thought about that often. He'd made his point, had forced the change, had demonstrated that his authority superseded hers. He didn't need to do it again. One show of power was apparently enough to rearrange the entire system. One Tuesday morning, as Karen was opening the gates, she saw a child approaching who didn't look like any of the regular families. She was young, maybe 9, thin, with dark skin and her hair in cornrows, moving with the particular caution of someone who didn't know if she was welcome. Karen's old instincts fired up. Not in the area, doesn't belong. Get the information, find the reason to say no. But she didn't say those things. Instead, she said, "Hi, do you need help finding anything?" The girl looked surprised, as though she'd prepared for a confrontation. "I'm looking for the pool," she said, and her voice was small and uncertain. "Is this it?" "This is it," Karen said. "Do you live in the neighborhood?" "My grandmother does, on Walnut Street. Is that in the... am I allowed?" Walnut Street. Walnut was squarely in the original district, the part Karen would have approved immediately under any circumstance. "What's your name?" Karen asked. "Aisha." "Well, Aisha, you're absolutely welcome here," Karen said, and she meant it, and she could feel something shift in herself as she said it. "Do you need help getting checked in?" The girl's face transformed with relief. "Yes, please," she said. Karen walked her through the registration process, and as she did, she found herself telling Aisha about the different pool areas, mentioning that there was a great group of kids in the 9-12 age group if she wanted to join them, asking if she knew how to swim or if she'd want to take lessons. She was, she realized, being kind. Not performing kindness, not using it as a tool, but actually trying to make someone else's experience better. It was disorienting. Aisha swam for 2 hours. By the time she left, she'd made friends with 3 other children and signed up for advanced stroke classes starting in September. When Aisha's grandmother came to pick her up, she approached Karen with a warm smile. "Thank you so much for taking care of her," the older woman said. "She's been so excited about the pool all summer. I wasn't sure we'd be able to afford lessons, but she said the town program was..." She trailed off, noticing Karen's expression. "What?" "She wasn't sure she'd be allowed," Karen said quietly. The grandmother's smile faded. She exchanged a look with Karen that was complicated and knowing and sad. "Yeah," she said, "a lot of us aren't always sure." That evening, Karen drove to Derek's office and asked him for a meeting. She brought her laptop and she brought printouts, and she sat across from him and told him that she wanted to propose a new program. "What kind of program?" Derek asked, looking wary. "A community outreach program," Karen said. "For kids in neighboring areas who might not know about pool access. We could go to the schools, put up posters at community centers. Let families know that they're welcome, that the pool isn't just for people who know about it from generations of using it." Derek leaned back in his chair. "This is kind of a 180 from June," he said. I was wrong in June, Karen said. She felt the words land in her chest, heavy and real. I thought I was protecting something, but I was actually just excluding people. I didn't understand the difference until someone made me. Derek was quiet for a long moment. By September, the pool had transformed in ways that went beyond the simple addition of new faces. The energy had fundamentally shifted. What had once been a quiet, controlled space had become something louder and more chaotic and undeniably more alive. Karen had implemented her community outreach program with the intensity she'd once applied to exclusion. She'd gone to 3 elementary schools and 2 community centers, had put up posters in Spanish and Mandarin and Somali, had worked with the town's community liaison to create materials that specifically invited families who'd never used the pool before. The response was overwhelming. By the first week of September, before many children had even returned to school, the pool was at capacity almost every afternoon. The quiet lap swimmer hours in the morning still existed, but they'd been joined by recreational swim times, by water aerobics classes, by birthday parties and family swim nights. The pool had gone from a sanctuary of order to something that resembled a small, chlorinated civilization. Karen had expected to hate it. She didn't. What she'd discovered was that her need for control had been masking a deeper need, which was to be useful in a way that actually meant something. Excluding people had been easy. It required only a clear rule and the willingness to enforce it. But including people, actively working to make sure that families felt welcome and safe and connected to the space, was harder and infinitely more satisfying. She trained new staff. She created a buddy system for first-time visitors. She learned the names of regular families and asked about their weeks. She started to see the pool not as a kingdom she ruled, but as a community space that belonged to all of them. It wasn't a sudden transformation. She still had moments where she wanted to go back to the way things were, when things were simpler and smaller. But those moments became less frequent. What she didn't expect was that the other changes would come from a different direction entirely. 3 weeks into September, Karen was doing her morning opening routine when she noticed something odd. The gatehouse had a back window that looked into a maintenance closet, and in that closet, the door to the pool area was slightly ajar when it should have been locked. Her first instinct was alarm, but her second instinct, the one she'd been trying to cultivate, was curiosity. Someone had opened that door. Someone was in the pool area before it was officially opened. She went around to the back and pushed the door open. Inside, she found a man in the shallow end of the pool, moving through the water with careful, deliberate motions. He was middle-aged, maybe 60s, using what looked like modified swimming strokes, moving one arm easily and the other with visible effort. He hadn't noticed her. He was focused entirely on the water, on his own body, on the simple act of movement. Karen recognized him as Robert Huang, who'd been coming to the pool in early mornings for maybe a month now. He usually came at the official opening time, always with the same routine, always alone. "We're not officially open yet," Karen said, and then, because she was trying to be better, she softened her voice and added, "But you're welcome to keep going if you want." Robert stopped and turned to look at her. He had a kind face, with laugh lines around his eyes and something tired around his mouth. "I didn't think anyone would be here," he said. "I used to volunteer here years ago. I have a key from back then. I thought I'd just grab 20 minutes before the crowd came." "You can come earlier if you want," Karen said. "Let me know. I can make sure you have quiet time." Robert's expression shifted, surprised. "Really?" "Really," Karen said. "What time works for you?" 7, he said. "I had a stroke last year. The physical therapist says water therapy is good for me, but I get tired with all the kids and the noise." Karen understood. She understood having a need for quiet. She understood using that need as armor against a world that felt too chaotic. 7 is perfect, she said. "I'll have a lane reserved." Robert came back the next morning at 7 a.m., and Karen had the lap section set up and waiting. He swam his modified strokes, and Karen pretended not to notice the effort it took him to complete even a short distance. By the end of the week, there were 4 people coming at 7 a.m. By the end of the month, there were 12. They became the morning swimmers, a community unto themselves. They had their own rhythm, their own hierarchy, their own unspoken rules about lane assignments and pace, and they were fierce advocates for the pool's continued existence and expansion. It was Robert who first mentioned the closure rumors. He approached Karen on an October morning after his swim, when the pool was still quiet and the sun was just cresting the tree line. "Have you heard?" he said. "Heard what?" "The town's cutting the recreation budget. There's a shortfall, and apparently the pool uses a lot of water." He said it like it was obvious, like of course a pool used water, which it did, but apparently that was now a problem. "My wife heard about it at the community board meeting. They're looking at closing the pool for the winter and possibly not reopening it in spring." Karen felt the world tilt slightly. "That's not possible," she said. "Derek would have told me." "Maybe he doesn't know yet," Robert said. "Or maybe he's waiting to see how it plays out. Budget stuff is weird." Karen left work at noon, something she never did, and drove to Derek's office. She found him at his desk, eating a sad sandwich and looking at his computer with the expression of a man reviewing his own execution. "Is the pool being closed?" Karen asked without preamble. Derek looked up, guilty. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When, after they drain the water?" "It's not a done deal," Derek said. He set down his sandwich, abandoning the pretense that he'd been enjoying it. "The town did the quarterly budget review, and apparently water usage is through the roof because of the increased attendance. The pool uses about 40,000 gallons a day on average, and now with the higher capacity, we're looking at closer to 80,000. "That's still not that much," Karen said, "in the scheme of the town's budget." "It's not about the absolute amount," Derek said. "It's about the visible line item. With the increased usage, the pool went from a line that people didn't notice to a line that people notice. And people notice things they think they can cut." "Then we fight," Karen said. "We show them the benefit. We show them the numbers on community engagement, on kids learning to swim on." "Karen," Derek's voice was gentle, "I appreciate the passion, but the truth is, the pool was already on the chopping block before you opened it up. The previous administration had been talking about divesting from it for years. Opening it up to more people just accelerated the timeline. If you'd kept it exclusive, they probably would have let it run for another 10 years quietly. But now that it's popular, now that people use it, now that it's actually become valued in the community, that visibility makes it a target." Karen sat down in the chair across from his desk. She felt like she was watching a particularly cruel joke play itself out in real time. She'd done the right thing, had fixed what was broken, and in fixing it, she'd apparently guaranteed its destruction. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "December 1st, Derek said. "They're going to close it for the winter anyway. The question is whether they'll reopen it in March or whether they'll just leave it closed and recoup the water budget permanently." "That's 2 months, Karen said. "Yes." "We need to organize," Karen said. "We need to get community support. We need to show them." "I know," Derek said, "and I think you should do that. Honestly, I think you have a real shot at saving it. The community actually cares now. That's your leverage." Karen approached Robert at 7 a.m. the next morning, as he was beginning his measured laps. "The pool is being closed in December," she told him, "potentially permanently." Robert stopped swimming. He pulled himself up on the edge, water streaming off his still-recovering shoulder, and he looked at Karen with an expression that shifted from surprise to something harder. "What?" he said. "Budget cuts. The town is divesting from the recreation budget." Robert didn't speak for a long moment. He was processing something. Finally, he said, "We have to save it." "I don't know how," Karen said. "Derek thinks community advocacy might work, but—" "Then that's what we do," Robert said. "We organize, we go to the community board, we make noise." He climbed out of the pool and went to the changing room, and when he emerged, he looked like a man who'd just been given a mission. Karen had expected him to say something kind, something about how sorry he was that her work had been undermined. Instead, he'd moved straight to solution. Word spread through the morning swimmers like infection. By the following week, they'd organized a meeting in the pool's community room. By the week after that, they had 40 people signed up to attend the town council meeting where the pool closure would be formally discussed. The effort should have felt natural to Karen. In a way, it did. Organizing was something she was good at, something she understood. But there was a fundamental difference between organizing people to comply with rules and organizing people to fight for something they believed in. The first meeting was on a Wednesday night in late October. The community room at the pool filled with people Karen recognized, Robert and the morning swimmers, the families she'd outreached to, the children who'd learned to swim in the pool's programs, teachers from the schools she'd visited, and people Karen had never seen before who'd apparently heard about the fight and come to participate. Karen stood in front of them, her heart pounding. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "Most of you know by now that the town is planning to close the pool in December. What you might not know is that there's a real possibility they won't reopen it, and I'm not okay with that." She pulled up slides on a projector. Enrollment numbers, growth statistics, community demographics showing who was using the pool now versus who had used it before, health outcomes, educational benefits. She'd prepared for a presentation because preparation was what she knew how to do. "This pool was supposed to be exclusive," Karen said, and her voice wavered slightly. "I was very good at making sure it was exclusive. I was very good at deciding who belonged and who didn't, and I was very wrong." She walked through the story of Isaiah Chen, not because it made her look good. It didn't, but because it was the truth. She talked about the gatekeeping, about the authorization from the mayor, about the moment when she'd understood that she was wrong, and that admitting it was the only way forward. "But here's what matters now," she said. "This pool isn't about me or my rules anymore. It's about this community. It's about kids learning to swim and staying safe. It's about people like Robert learning to rebuild after illness. It's about families having a place to come together and experience joy, which shouldn't be a luxury. And it's about us deciding that we're not going to let this facility be taken away." The room erupted in applause. They organized. They created a petition that got over 2,000 signatures. They reached out to local media, and a reporter from the county newspaper came and did a story on the closure and why it mattered. They coordinated with the school board to emphasize the pool's role in swim instruction and water safety education. They got letters from the hospital where the physical therapist worked, detailing the therapeutic benefits of aquatic medicine. And then, 3 days before the town council meeting, something shifted. Karen got a call from Mayor Harrison's office. His assistant was professional and vague, suggesting that the mayor would like to meet with Karen to discuss the pool situation. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in the mayor's office downtown. Karen showed up in her nicest clothes, a blue blazer she'd bought for her ex-husband's company events a decade ago, and tried to prepare herself for anything. What preparation could look like, she had no idea. Mayor Harrison's office was exactly what Karen expected. Wood paneling, framed community photos, a large desk with a computer and very few personal items. The mayor himself looked exactly as he had when he'd arrived at the pool in June. Distinguished, composed, radiating the particular charisma of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, standing to shake her hand, "thank you for meeting with me." "Of course, Mayor," she said, "though I have to say I'm not sure what this is about." "The pool," he said. He gestured for her to sit. "I understand there's been quite an advocacy effort for keeping it open." "Yes," Karen said carefully. "The community has rallied together. We have community support, media attention." "I know," the mayor said. "I'm aware of all of it, and I want to be honest with you about something." He leaned back in his chair, and his expression shifted from charm to something more complex. "That situation in June with the boy, I didn't do that because I was uniquely committed to fairness," he said. "I did it because Councilwoman Ackafer called my office, and she was very clear that how we handled that situation would affect how she advocated for me in the next budget negotiations. Political calculation. I want to be straight with you about that." Karen didn't know what to say. She'd come prepared to defend her position, but his honesty had disarmed her. "The reason I'm telling you this," he continued, "is because I want you to understand something else. The pool situation isn't about budget anymore. The town council has the votes to approve the closure because everyone wants to look fiscally responsible, but there's a workaround." "What do you mean?" Karen asked. "I mean," the mayor said, "that if you could get community advocacy strong enough, if you could make it politically untenable for the council to vote for closure, they would likely vote for keeping it open instead. What makes it untenable is showing them that the people who use the pool actually care, that they vote, that they show up, that there are consequences for failing to represent them." Karen understood what he was saying. He was telling her that he couldn't save the pool for her. But he was also telling her that if the community decided to save it themselves, he wouldn't stand in the way. He might even help. "So what you're saying is..." "I'm saying," the mayor said, "get your people to the council meeting. Get them to speak. Make the council understand that this isn't a budget item, it's a political liability, and maybe you can save something that you started out trying to destroy." He smiled, and his smile was knowing and a little bit cruel, but also fair in its own way. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said, and the meeting was clearly over. The town council meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the high school auditorium, which had been selected specifically because it could hold the number of people expected to attend. The Recreation Committee's proposal was for temporary closure of aquatic facilities to reduce municipal water usage and redirect resources to essential services, which was bureaucratic language for, "We're going to shut this down and hope nobody notices if it stays shut." Corinne spent Tuesday afternoon in a state of controlled panic. She'd prepared remarks. She'd briefed Robert and a handful of other key speakers on what to say and how to say it. She'd coordinated with Diane Chen to make sure Isaiah would be there, not to speak, but just to exist in the room as living proof of what the pool had done. She'd also, somewhat to her surprise, coordinated with Mayor Harrison's office, who had confirmed that the mayor would attend the meeting and would make a brief statement of his own. By 6:45 p.m., the auditorium was nearly full. Corinne had expected maybe 200 people. There were closer to 400. She saw families she'd outreached to, morning swimmers in their best casual clothes, teachers and coaches, the physical therapist who'd written the letter about therapeutic benefits, kids she recognized from the pool's programs. She saw Isaiah and Diane Chen sitting 3 rows from the front. She also saw people she didn't recognize, people who'd probably come because they'd heard about it, who cared about public facilities on some theoretical level, who wanted to live in the kind of town that supported its community. The council members looked surprised. They'd come prepared for polite disagreement from maybe a handful of people. Instead, they were looking at a standing room-only crowd that was still swelling as people filed into the auditorium. The meeting was called to order at 7:02 p.m. The council went through the usual procedural items: approval of previous minutes, financial reports, some zoning amendment that Corinne didn't care about. Then, 45 minutes in, they reached the item on the agenda that everyone was there for. "Recreational Facilities Committee Report," the council president said. "Regarding proposed closure of Riverside Community Pool, Mrs. Henderson, would you like to present?" Mrs. Henderson, who Corinne recognized as the chair of the Recreation Committee and who had voted to close the pool at the committee level, stood and walked to the podium. She looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said. "As you know, the town's budget situation requires us to identify areas where expenses can be reduced. The Riverside Community Pool, while valued by many in the community, represents a significant recurring expense, particularly in terms of water usage and maintenance. We're proposing closure of the facility for the winter season, during which demand is significantly lower anyway, with a review in spring as to whether reopening is fiscally feasible." That was the nice version. Corinne translated it mentally to what they all knew it meant: "We're closing it forever and hoping you get over it." "Now," Mrs. Henderson continued, "we've received a petition from community members requesting that the pool remain open, and we've also received requests to hear community testimony on this matter. The council has approved allowing up to 15 minutes of public comment, after which we'll take a vote." A hand was already raised, then another, then 3 more. Corinne recognized the first person to be called on: Dr. Patterson, a family physician who worked at County Medical. "Thank you," Dr. Patterson said, approaching the microphone. She was a woman in her 50s with gray streaking her hair and an air of someone used to being listened to. "I want to speak to you about what I've observed in my practice since the pool opened its doors to more members of the community." She pulled up data on a tablet: growth in physical activity among school-age children, reduction in asthma and obesity metrics, increased participation in water safety education programs. She was clinical and precise, using the language of medicine to make it clear that the pool wasn't a luxury. It was a health intervention. "Keeping the pool open has direct implications for public health in this town," she concluded. "Closing it would be a step backward." The next speaker was a teacher from Lincoln Elementary. She talked about the swim curriculum and how the pool facility made it possible to teach water safety to every single student who came through her school. She talked about the children who'd learned to swim there who might otherwise have grown up without that survival skill. Then Robert stood up. Karen felt her throat tighten as he approached the microphone. Robert didn't walk with perfect ease. His recovery from the stroke was ongoing, but he walked with purpose. "I had a stroke last year," he said, and his voice carried across the auditorium in a way that suggested he'd practiced this. "I've been relearning how to do basic things, move my arm, balance, swim. The pool has been instrumental in my physical recovery, but it's been something else too. It's given me back something I thought I'd lost, which is the ability to do something I loved. And I'm not the only person who's experienced that." He looked out at the auditorium, making eye contact with the council members. "I understand the budget situation," he said. "I understand that tough choices need to be made, but closing a facility that's helping people heal, that's teaching kids to be safe, that's bringing a community together, that's not a tough choice. That's an abdication of responsibility." He returned to his seat, and the room erupted in applause. Diane Chen spoke next. She talked about Isaiah, about what swimming had meant to him, about the way it had changed his confidence and his summer. She talked about how the mayor had done her a kindness, but how that kindness should have been unnecessary, that kids shouldn't have to wait for someone with authority to override bad rules. They should just be welcome. "Thank you for fixing that," she said to the council. "Please don't undo it by closing the pool." Karen had prepared remarks, but she was going to be the last speaker before the council deliberated. She waited as person after person stood up. Coaches, volunteer staff, parents of kids who'd learned to swim there, teenagers who'd gotten jobs in the pool's programs. 15 minutes became 20, became 30. The council president said, "I think we need to cut off public comment soon." But nobody wanted to be the one to actually make that motion. Because to cut off public comment was to silence people, and silencing people who cared this much about something required a particular kind of moral courage. Finally, 40 minutes after the public comment had begun, Karen was called to speak. She approached the microphone and looked out at the auditorium. She saw Isaiah looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She saw Robert, who gave her an encouraging nod. She saw Derek sitting in the back, looking like a man watching his own life become much more complicated. "I need to tell you something," Karen said, and her voice sounded small in the auditorium. "When the pool changed its access policies in June, I wasn't happy about it. I'm not going to lie and say I was. I've spent the last 16 years making sure this pool was exclusive, was controlled, was restricted to a specific kind of community, and I was very good at it." She could feel the auditorium's attention shift. They'd expected gratitude, probably, or a speech about community values. They weren't expecting a confession. "I was wrong," Karen said. "Not just about the policy, but about what I thought the pool should be. I thought it should be protected from the wrong kind of people. Except the wrong kind of people were just people. They were kids who wanted to learn to swim. They were families who deserved to use public facilities. They were neighbors that I had decided didn't belong, and I was the only one who decided that." She could see some of the council members shift uncomfortably. She was making them think about things they didn't want to think about, things like who had been excluded, why, and whether they were comfortable with that. "Mayor came to the pool in June and told me that the pool was for everyone in the service area," Karen continued. "I didn't want to accept that, but he was right and I was wrong and I had to change. Now I'm asking you to understand something. When we changed the access policy, what happened was that the pool stopped being my kingdom and started being ours, all of ours. And yes, that made it busier and louder and less controlled, but it also made it real. It made it matter." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was stronger. "Closing the pool now would be betraying everyone who believed that it was worth opening. It would be saying that inclusion was temporary, that community only mattered as a political tool, that we never actually meant it when we said this facility was for everyone. I'm asking you not to do that. I'm asking you to keep it open." She stepped away from the microphone, and the applause came immediately, filling the auditorium like a wave. The council voted 45 minutes later, after deliberation that was surprisingly quick. The vote was 5-2 in favor of keeping the pool open. There would need to be some operational adjustments, some partnership with the town's water conservation effort, perhaps some fundraising to address the increased costs. But the pool would remain open. The vote itself wasn't shocking. What was shocking was what happened after. Mayor Harrison approached Karen as she was gathering her things, the crowd still lingering and celebrating around them. "That was a good speech," he said. "Thank you," Karen said. She didn't know what else to say. She was still riding the adrenaline of having spoken publicly about her own failure. "I meant what I said before," the mayor continued. "About the pool becoming political once you opened it. You've made it impossible to close now. The council doesn't have the political capital to vote for closure with that kind of community support." "Is that a problem?" Corinne asked. "No," the mayor said. "Actually, it's exactly what I was hoping would happen, but I want you to understand the mechanism. You made the pool matter to people. That makes it safe. That also makes it powerful." He walked away before Corinne could respond. That night, Corinne couldn't sleep. She lay in bed and thought about what the mayor had said. She thought about power and exclusion and the difference between keeping something safe and keeping it small. She thought about how she'd spent 16 years making the pool matter to very few people, and how in 3 months she'd made it matter to hundreds. She thought about justice, and whether this counted as justice, and whether Isaiah Chen getting to swim in the pool was enough to make up for all the times she'd said no to people before he'd had the political power to make her say yes. It wasn't enough, she understood that now, but it was something, it was a beginning. November came to Millbrook like it always did, with a shift in light and temperature, and the particular ache that came from watching summer turn to memory. The pool remained open, though some operational adjustments had been made. Slightly reduced hours during the slow season, a partnership with the town's rainwater collection system that meant the pool would use less municipal water while still maintaining safety standards, and a small fundraising effort organized by Robert and the morning swimmers to help cover the increased costs. Corinne had hoped that solving the closure crisis would make her feel better. Instead, she felt hollow. She was doing everything right now. She was inclusive. She was welcoming. She had become, by all accounts, a good person. But she carried the weight of having been a bad one, and no amount of current kindness seemed to fully erase that. Isaiah came to the pool almost every day, even as the seasons changed and the air grew cold. He joined the competitive swim team that the pool had formally established in September, and he trained with the kind of dedication that suggested swimming had become something central to his identity. Corinne watched him from the gatehouse, and sometimes he'd wave at her, and she'd wave back, and they had a polite relationship. But it was cordial rather than warm. Isaiah was 8 or 9 years younger than her, but he carried himself with a dignity that made the age gap feel irrelevant. One Thursday in November, as Corinne was doing her closing checklist, Isaiah approached her. "Hey, Ms. Corinne," he said. "Hi, Isaiah," Corinne replied. "How was practice?" "Good," he said. He was dressed in street clothes now, his swimsuit and a bag on his shoulder. "I wanted to say thank you." Corinne wasn't expecting that. "For what?" she asked. "For letting me come to the pool," Isaiah said. "I know you didn't want to at first. My mom told me how it happened, how the mayor had to make you let me in. But anyway, I just wanted to say it changed things for me. I didn't know I liked swimming this much, and I'm good at it. I didn't know I could be good at something like that." Corinne felt something in her chest fracture. "Isaiah, I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I said no that day. I'm sorry you needed the mayor to make me say yes. You should have been welcome from the beginning." Isaiah shrugged in the way teenagers did, with the wisdom of youth that had already learned that sometimes adults did the wrong thing, and you just had to move forward anyway. "Yeah, well," he said, "you changed, that's something." He walked away, and Corinne stood in the gatehouse and cried, quietly and thoroughly, the kind of crying that came from guilt and recognition, and the understanding that even when you did the right thing, you were still living in a world that required you to do the right thing in the first place. Winter brought isolation. The pool's hours contracted. The crowd of summer regulars dispersed as school started and the weather turned cold. The morning swimmers remained, but even they were fewer in numbers, Robert eventually saying that the cold was hard on his shoulder and that he'd come back in spring. Corinne found herself alone in the gatehouse for hours at a time. She had time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. She thought about what she'd been protecting when she'd said no to families. She thought about how the language of protection and the language of exclusion sounded so similar from the inside, how easily one slid into the other. She thought about the difference between a rule and justice, and how she'd confused them for so long. In December, she reached out to Derek with a proposal. "I want to organize a community advisory board for the pool," she said. "Representatives from families who use it, staff members, community partners. I don't want to make decisions about access unilaterally anymore. I want this to be a shared process. Derek approved the proposal, probably because he'd learned not to argue with Karen on anything related to the pool. The advisory board's first meeting was scheduled for early January, after the holidays. In the meantime, Karen did something she'd never done before. She invited people to her home. It started as a small thing. She ran into Diane Chen at the grocery store, and before she could stop herself, she said, "Would you and Isaiah like to come over for dinner sometime?" Diane had looked surprised, but had said yes, and they'd set a date for the Saturday before Christmas. Karen spent an entire week preparing. She cooked a roast chicken, made a vegetable stir-fry, baked a chocolate cake from scratch. She cleaned her entire house, getting rid of magazines from 2019 and organizing the chaos of her life into neat containers and clean surfaces. When Diane and Isaiah arrived, they brought wine and flowers, and the dinner was awkward and warm at the same time. Isaiah was polite but not particularly engaged, and Diane worked overtime at conversation. But there was an attempt being made, a willingness on both sides to bridge the gap that had been created. "This is really nice," Diane said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I don't usually get to do things like this. With work and everything, there's not a lot of time for social stuff." "How are you doing?" Karen asked. "With work?" "Busy," Diane said. "Hospital's always busy, especially in winter, flu season and everything, but it's good work, it matters." "It does," Karen said. She thought about the way Diane had come to the pool that first day with such hope, how quickly that hope had been extinguished by Karen's no. "I'm sorry again about June. I've thought about it a lot." Diane smiled, and it was a kind smile, but also a tired one, the kind of smile that said she'd already forgiven Karen because she didn't have the energy not to. "I know you are," Diane said, "and I appreciate that. But I also want to say something, which is that I don't think you were uniquely evil. You were just participating in something that was already there. The way institutions keep some people in and some people out, you were just the face of it." "That doesn't make it better," Karen said. "No," Diane agreed. "But it means the solution isn't just you being a better person. It's about the whole system needing to work differently. Anyway, that's a lot of heavy stuff for dinner. This cake is really good." After they left, Karen sat at her dining room table and thought about what Diane had said, about systems and institutions and the way that individual change was necessary but not sufficient. She thought about what it would mean to not just be a good individual person, but to actually work toward making the structures themselves more just. It was bigger than the pool, but the pool was where she could start. The advisory board met on January 6th, on a cold Tuesday evening in the pool's community room. Karen had invited 12 people: Robert, Diane, a coach from the swim team, 2 teachers, a parent, a staff member, Isaiah's best friend from the swim program who'd learned to swim at another pool but had become a fixture at Riverside, a representative from the town's community liaison office, Derek, and 2 people Karen didn't know but who'd requested to join because they used the pool regularly. Karen had prepared an agenda. She'd also prepared for the possibility that this might be awkward, or that people might not care about having a seat at the table that felt like it had already been set. What she hadn't prepared for was Robert taking over the meeting almost immediately. "Thank you for organizing this," Robert said, looking at Karen. "But I want to suggest something. Instead of having Ms. Mitchell set the agenda for us, maybe we should set it ourselves. I think we have some things to discuss." Karen felt a moment of defensiveness rise in her, the old impulse to control, to direct, to be the person who made things happen. She pushed it down. "You're right," she said. "What do you think we should talk about?" What they talked about was access and equity and the way that despite the open policy, there were still barriers to participation. They talked about the cost of swimsuits and towels and the way that some families couldn't afford them. They talked about transportation. The pool wasn't on a direct bus line, and some families had to take 3 buses or pay for a car ride to get there. They talked about the way that even with an open policy, the cultural norms of the pool still reflected who'd been welcomed historically, and how making space for new people meant more than just opening the gates. "We should have free or low-cost swim gear available," one of the teachers said. "School did a clothing swap and it worked really well. We could do the same for swim stuff." "And scholarships for the swim program," the community liaison said. I know the program costs are kept low, but they're not free, and for some families, even low is too much. What about transportation? Diane asked. Is there any way to coordinate pickup points? I know it seems small, but when you're working multiple jobs, an extra hour of transportation time is a barrier. They spent 2 hours generating ideas. By the end of the meeting, they'd created a list of 12 concrete suggestions for improving access. Corinne was supposed to be leading this process, but instead, she found herself sitting quietly and taking notes, learning that her role could be support rather than control. As people were leaving, Robert approached her. "Thank you for doing this," he said. "I didn't do much," Corinne said. "You all did the actual thinking." "No," Robert said. "You did the hard part. You admitted you were wrong and you stepped back. That's harder than most people manage." By February, they'd implemented 4 of the 12 suggestions. They'd organized a community donation drive for swim gear, which had yielded enough swimsuits and towels to outfit new swimmers without worry. They'd established a scholarship fund for the competitive swim team. They'd started a van service that picked kids up from 3 central locations during summer months and brought them to the pool. And Corinne had stepped back from being the person in charge and had become, instead, the person who made things possible. It was less satisfying than control, but it was better. It was actually useful. March arrived like a promise kept. The ice melted. The trees began to bud. The light shifted from the thin, cold quality of winter to something warmer and more generous. And the pool, which had been running at minimal capacity through the winter months, began to prepare for the return of summer. Corinne had spent the winter months doing something she'd never done before. She'd actually liked her life. Not just endured it or controlled it, but genuinely enjoyed the people in it. Robert had become a real friend. They had coffee once a week and talked about his physical therapy and her ongoing evolution as a human being. Diane had become someone she thought of as a peer rather than someone she'd wronged. And Isaiah, though they weren't close, had become someone she felt genuine affection for rather than guilt about. The pool's transformation had also continued in ways that Corinne hadn't anticipated. A local journalist had done a longer piece about the pool's history, its near closure, and its resurrection as a community hub. The piece had gotten picked up by regional media. The state's Parks and Recreation Department had called to ask if they could do a case study on the pool's inclusive model. Corinne had recommended they interview Robert and Diane instead of her. She said it was because they were the real community representatives. What she meant was that she'd spent enough time being the face of things, and it was time to step back. But as March turned to April, Corinne started to feel a familiar anxiety creeping back in. The pool was about to get busy again. The careful balance they'd established during winter was about to be disrupted by hundreds of new and returning swimmers. The chaos she'd learned to tolerate was about to multiply. She brought this up at the advisory board meeting in mid-April. "I'm nervous about summer," she admitted. "I know that's not a very noble thing to say, but I am. Things are going to get crowded and complicated again, and I'm worried about losing what we've built." Robert leaned back in his chair. "That's actually a good thing to be nervous about," he said. "It means you care about the outcome rather than just about control. Last year you would have been nervous about order breaking down. Now you're nervous about losing connection. That's progress." "But how do we maintain connection when there are 400 people here every day?" Corinne asked. "We probably don't," the community liaison said. "But we could maintain connection through the advisory board. We could make sure that even as the pool gets bigger and busier, there's a structure for community voices to be heard." They spent the meeting planning for summer, expansion of volunteer opportunities, training for new staff who would join for the season, protocols for handling conflicts, ideas for community events. It felt like work, but it also felt meaningful in a way that her earlier gatekeeping had never felt. The pool opened for the summer on Memorial Day weekend, and it was exactly as busy and chaotic as Corinne had feared. Within the first hour, every lane was occupied. The shallow end was full of young children learning to swim. The bleachers were packed with parents and grandparents and people just trying to cool off on a warm day. Corinne stood in the gatehouse and felt the urge to find a rule to enforce, to create some order to take back control. Instead, she got up and walked to the pool deck. She found families looking confused about where to go, and she welcomed them. She found a child crying because he was scared of the water, and she sat with him and talked about what swimming could feel like. She found teenagers trying to impress each other by doing risky dives, and she gently redirected them to safer areas while acknowledging their need to show off. This was the work, not the gatekeeping, but the presence, the care, the willingness to see people and help them find their place. By mid-June, the pool had settled into a rhythm. The chaos was real, but it was purposeful chaos, the kind that came from a space being genuinely used by its community. The advisory board had grown to 20 people. Volunteer opportunities had attracted 40 people who came regularly to help with programs and maintenance. The swimming programs had expanded to include water aerobics for seniors, swim lessons for adults who'd never learned, and competitive teams for kids at various levels. And then, one morning in late June, as Karen was opening the gatehouse, she found a familiar car pulling up to the pool. Mayor Harrison got out, in his swimming trunks and an old t-shirt, moving like he'd come to swim. Karen's first instinct was alarm. Had something gone wrong? Was there another policy issue? Instead, the mayor approached her with a smile. "Good morning, Karen," he said. "I want to swim today. Thought I'd get in a few laps before work." "Of course," Karen said. She paused, then added, "We have a reserved lane for early morning swimmers if you'd like it." "Nah," the mayor said. "I'll take whatever's available. I want to see what it's really like when it's busy. I want to see what I saved." He headed into the pool area, and Karen watched him approach one of the busy lanes. One of the teenagers recognized him and made a face about having to share her lane with the mayor, but she moved over without making it a whole thing. The mayor dove in and began swimming, not with great technique, but with obvious enjoyment, moving through the crowded water like he belonged there just as much as everyone else. Which he did, and so did everyone else. That evening, Karen sat in her apartment and allowed herself to think about the arc of the past year. From June, when she'd said no to Isaiah and had been certain in her refusal, to now, when the same child swam competitively and had friends and belonged completely. From her certainty about rules and boundaries to her current understanding that both of those things were far more complicated than she'd believed. From control to trust, from gatekeeping to welcome. She thought about the mayor's question, did she regret the chain? A year ago, she would have said yes. A month ago, she might have said no with uncertainty. Now she could say it with absolute clarity, she didn't regret it. She had been wrong. Admitting that, actually internalizing it, had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. But the person she'd become by doing it was someone worth being. Her phone buzzed, a text from Robert. "Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I have something I want to talk to you about." Karen said yes immediately. Coffee with Robert was one of her favorite things now. She was 54 years old, and for the first time, she had a friend who wasn't connected to her work or her family obligation. She had a friend because they'd built it together, two people trying to be good. Outside her window, the sun was setting, and the light was that particular quality that came at the end of spring, full of promise and abundance. Tomorrow it would be hot. The pool would be crowded. There would be problems to solve and conflicts to navigate and moments of chaos. But there would also be Isaiah showing off for his friends, Robert swimming his careful laps, new families arriving for the first time, nervous and hopeful, the community that Karen had tried so hard to keep small suddenly enormous and alive and real. She'd spent 16 years building walls. It had taken one day with the mayor to crack them. But it was taking this whole year, this entire journey, to finally understand why walls were a bad idea in the first place. Tomorrow, she'd go back to the pool. She'd do her job with the knowledge that the job wasn't about control anymore. It was about service. It was about making sure that the space she'd once gate-kept so carefully now belonged to everyone who needed it. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was, but it was just, and that was something. That was actually everything. It was June again, exactly 1 year from the day Isaiah Chen had been turned away, and the pool looked different. Not physically. The water was the same blue, the lanes were marked the same way, the chlorine smell was identical. But the energy, the feeling of the place had transformed completely. Karen stood in the newly renovated gatehouse. The advisory board had convinced the town to upgrade the space, making it more welcoming and less fortress-like, and she looked out at the pool in full summer operation. The attendance had tripled from 2 years ago. The programs had expanded to include adaptive swimming for children and adults with disabilities, water safety classes for senior citizens, and competitive teams that had already won some regional competitions. The pool was, by all accounts, thriving. The mayor had come by several times over the year, mostly to swim, but also to observe. Last month, he'd mentioned that he was thinking about running for a higher office, state legislature, possibly. When Karen had asked why he was telling her, he'd said it was because the pool was his political base now. "They trust me because I kept my word," he'd said. "And I kept my word to you because you kept your word to yourself." Karen had nodded and said nothing, but she'd understood. Power was about reliability and about making sure the people who believed in you had real reasons to keep believing. Robert approached the gatehouse as the afternoon swimmers began to arrive. He was back swimming at the pool now that spring had turned to summer, though his times were slower than they'd been before the stroke. He'd told Karen that he didn't mind. The point was the swimming itself, not the speed. "Ready for the big event?" he asked. Karen had planned a one-year celebration of the pool's reopening. A party with free admission, music, food from local restaurants, and a recognition ceremony for people who'd helped save the pool. Nervous, Karen admitted, "I don't want to mess it up." "You're going to want to control everything," Robert said, and it was said with affection rather than criticism. "You're going to want to make sure every detail is perfect, and you're going to have to let people help you, and you're going to have to accept that it won't be perfect, and it's still going to be good." "I hate that you know me so well," Karen said. "That's what friends are for," Robert said. The celebration happened the following Saturday. 400 people showed up. The mayor gave a brief speech about community resilience. Diane Chen brought the same cookies she'd brought to the gatehouse a year ago, and this time, Karen didn't feel like they were evidence of her failure. She felt like they were evidence of her growth. Isaiah Chen won the Best New Swimmer award, which was an advisory board creation designed to celebrate someone who'd recently learned to swim. He accepted it with the easy confidence of a teenager who'd found something he was good at and had allowed it to make him feel good about himself. Karen stood at the edge of it all and watched her community thrive. This was different from her old satisfaction. It wasn't the pleasure of control. It was the pleasure of having been part of something bigger than herself, of having stepped aside enough to let that bigger thing actually breathe. As the celebration was winding down, the mayor approached her one more time. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "A year ago, I came here expecting to find a problem that needed fixing, a resistant gatekeeper who needed to be overridden. What I found instead was someone who was willing to be wrong and to actually do something about it. That's rare, Karen. Most people double down. You didn't." "I had help," Karen said. "You didn't have to do what you did for Isaiah. You could have just let the system work as is." "I know," the mayor said, "but I made a choice that day, and you made a choice afterward. The question now is, what are you going to do with that choice?" Karen thought about that for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "I want to keep working at the pool, but I also want to do something bigger. I want to help other communities look at their institutions and ask whether they're designed for inclusion or exclusion. I want to help other gatekeepers see what they're doing." The mayor smiled. "That's good work," he said. "That's important work. Let me know if you need anything." He walked away, and Karen stood in the fading evening light of late summer and allowed herself to feel something she'd been afraid to feel for a long time. Hope that she was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. This story is, in its deepest form, about the difference between control and justice. Karen Mitchell begins as someone who has confused these two things, who believes that maintaining order means excluding people who don't fit into her vision of community. The intervention of the mayor is key because it represents the reality that individual change, while necessary, is insufficient without systemic support. But Karen's real transformation doesn't come from being forced to change. It comes from her willingness to actually examine her own beliefs and to accept that she was wrong, that her wrongness had real consequences for real people, and that admitting this was the only way forward. The pool becomes a metaphor for community, for the ways that institutions can be designed to include or exclude, and for the way that opening systems to new people doesn't actually diminish the space for those who were already there. It enriches it. And Karen's journey becomes not just about her individual redemption, but about the possibility that people can genuinely change, that institutions can be reimagined, and that justice is possible when we're willing to do the difficult work of examining our own gatekeeping and choosing, consciously, to step aside.